Hello again, and this is the part 3 of chapter 5, in this video we try to put into the context or historical context what does macroeconomics imply, or how we can better understand the historical background of the emergence of macroeconomics as a branch of or as a sub-discipline of macroeconomics. So if you remember, we said that there are three major issues. I can write it here. These issues are going to be repeated over and over, but that is the whole point, that macroeconomics is discussing or is developing an appropriate way of explaining these phenomena, if you wish. So I would say that three major concerns, as we mentioned it before, concerns or phenomena. So phenomena is plural because it is three phenomena in macroeconomics. So I'm in this video, in part 3 of chapter 5, I would encourage you to read the textbooks, and you will learn a lot of. It's not just about the equations and graphs. There is some story behind it. So we want to, in this part of the chapter, before we start telling that what is what, you orient yourself in the economics discipline and fairly understand or acknowledge what macroeconomics is all about and where the story started actually. So we said that there are three major concerns of phenomena. One is the aggregate output. And I put in the bracket macroeconomic growth. Okay, so the growth is whether it's positively growing or negatively growing. That is a major concern. So how we can explain the growth of the macroeconomy, not individual firms. Number two is the basically unemployment. And here I put the rate, unemployment rate. And the third one is inflation or deflation. Inflation, again, the rate. So if the rate is negative, we call it deflation. Negative inflation is the deflation. So these are the problems which microeconomics is not explaining. And when Smith and Ricardo actually give life to the discipline, a scientific branch or science, a branch of science called economics, they did not talk about the macroeconomics, or maybe they did, but it was not spelled out, and it started from the micro components of the economics. So it is always the microeconomics, of course, is the backbone of the macroeconomics. But the rules or the theory here may differ from the theory here. And I told you that in other science also we have the same. In physics we have quantum physics for atoms, and we have general relativity theory for the astronomy and things like that. So in economics also there is not going to be single theory explaining both of them. There is always like basically these theories are unequal. So here we have theory of macroeconomics, here we have theory of microeconomics. Okay, why they're not the same? That's the mathematics are not coming through. Like in physics, the black holes or the singularities causes the problem that equations used for the atoms are not working for the macro and vice versa. Similar story in the micro exam. But the whole thing is that explanation of changes in the aggregate output and changes in the unemployment rate and inflation is not simply been explained by the demand and supply analysis. Demand and supply model. Okay, the chapter 3 model is the essence of the theory used in microeconomics. But here we need while still these are valid point, the equilibrium in the markets, but we have to look at large scale. At large scale, they may different. They may be different. So the person who first give this a proper explanation, or relatively proper, relatively more robust explanation of the macroeconomics, his name was actually there were more people, but this is the name which I want you to remember, and the name is John Maynard Keynes. If you don't know this name by the end of this semester, you should repeat the course. Just joking. John Maynard Keynes. Actually, before John Maynard Keynes, perhaps one of the prominent names which we should call it, but usually the economists are very doubtful to give the credit of macroeconomics to this person, and this person's name is Karl Marx. Karl Marx, because he's been known as the founder of socialism and the communist kind of doctrines. Hence, it is a very controversial name, but when you read the history of economic thoughts, actually he did contribute a lot in the formation of the macroeconomics. But honestly speaking, the John Maynard Keynes is standing out. He was not a communist and he was a liberal economist, but at the same time, his way of thinking actually said that don't use microeconomics principle for the events like aggregate output, unemployment, and inflation, because this is not going to work out for macroeconomic phenomena. Okay, so the John Maynard Keynes, he published his book in 1936, and ever since he's been known as the founder of modern macroeconomics. Okay, so that is, I want to tell you that how this story started and why it happens. The story is that the advocates of the microeconomics model was saying that, okay, if the growth is going down and we have like a problem of recession, don't panic. It is very temporarily a phenomena. If the unemployment rate goes very high, don't panic. Just let the market resolve it. It's a disequilibrium, and the thousands of market, including the input markets for the labor and capital and resources, they are in a state of disequilibrium, so the new equilibrium will emerge, and all these problems are going to be eradicated sooner or later. So these problems, according to the classical thinking, so these are called classical economists, classicals like Adam Smith and Ricardo and so many other names, the people who were believing on the classical economics, they were saying that these are short run. These problems of recession or unemployment rate or inflation are short run phenomena, and they're gonna go away sooner or later. Once the adjustments are taking in the markets are gonna be readjusted, and the new equilibrium will bring, and all the problem will be going away. But it was John Maynard Keynes with some history. Basically, let's see what happened in the history that forced the economists to think twice and perhaps listen to what Karl Marx was raising the eyebrows of many in explaining the economic phenomena. But basically, if we look at the history, we see that these problems sometimes severely coming, and during the war or during some turmoils or economic disease, and we can name this World War I, and this was during 1914, if you remember from the history, to 1921, which basically it was not ended by, it was a bird flu or a Spanish flu which caused it to stop because the soldiers becoming like a COVID issue sick, and then eventually it stopped. But there was no GDP in those times, as we are going to talk about it in next, but aggregate output, we could say that now that we are doing analysis about the aggregate output, it was clearly a downturn of the economy. So the output of the nation, and they were saying, oh, this is because of the political tension, aggression between countries. So the war is basically bringing down the economies. And then we have another similar situation in World War II, you know that, and that was started in 1929 to 1939, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry, 1939, I wrote about another started 1939 and it ended 1945. Yes, sorry, I was looking at my notes and I put the wrong one. 1939 and 1945, and you may have studied this. And again, that there was a downturn of the economy, and there was aggression between countries, and there was turmoils, and there was what is called human catastrophe. Human catastrophe. Here also was turmoil. And between these two incidents, things were not normal also. We had something called the Great Depression. Yes, the note which I was writing, this was started in 1929, and it peaked in 1933. So this started in August 1929 and in September 1930, but it lasted longer until 1929, 1939, which was joined with the Second World War. So stories soon after this war ended, the countries were still in trouble. Many countries facing production drop, not at factory levels, at national level, and This phenomenon is known as the Great Depression. John Maynard Keynes carefully studied this. And you know that he published his book, I just said it, 1936. So he brought up an explanation which was different from demand and supply analysis, and said the reason that we have the Great Depression and some examples of the earlier time, it is because economists are saying that leave it to the market, the problem is going to be resolved. I'm afraid it's not going to be resolved, and this is the reason that the recession is become prolonged, and if it is prolonged we call it depression. Okay, John Maynard Keynes, when he was explaining about these things in economics, he was an active economist in the Bretton Woods conference, Bretton Woods treaty, let me call it treaty. This group of economists were saying that our demand and supply analysis are useful, but it's like when you're healthy, do it demand and supply analysis, but when you're sick, you should go doctor and take medication. So the long run issue, or the problems are short run, and when the demand and supply say that in the long run, they were saying that in the long run, all problems will be resolved. And Keynes was saying a very interesting quote is from him, that in the long run, we are all dead. So he was basically criticizing this way of thinking, that full adjustments, if we wait for it, it might be too late. So he was saying that if the economy is seriously sick, it's like going to the dentist. He exactly used this expression, going to the dentist. We don't go to dentist every day. We may only go when we have toothache. And we're not going to let the body die till the ache go away. We just pull out the problem. So he was saying that this idea of laissez-faire or laissez-passer, the French expression for free market theory, may not work from time to time. And there is a serious need for government intervention. So this was unaccepted by the classical thinkers, and this is the idea which is called the Keynesian revolution. Keynesian revolution. Okay, and it gives us a different way of thinking of explaining the recession and inflation and unemployment rate. So historically thinking, his story started from that moment. And by the way, he was an active economist. As I told you, the Bretton Woods was in 1944 in a place, or in a city, in a hotel near Seattle City in Washington State, not Washington DC, the Washington near District of Columbia in Vancouver. It's that part of the northwest of United States. The group of economists, mostly economists, get together, and the bankers were not there. Bankers were not invited. That's interesting thing to know, that economists were there and the politicians to get the advice from the economists. And number one economist in that group was John Maynard Keynes. And the agreement they did is now known as the Bretton Woods Treaty, which lasts until 1971. And I'm going to tell you what happened. But apart from these, three things happened actually at the same year. They formed the foundation of the World Bank. And John Maynard Keynes, you see that how popular and how he, by the way, he was the professor of Cambridge University, and he was highly respected academically as well. World Bank was formed, the International Monetary Fund was formed, and also the United Nations at the same time. All happened, and then the World War II, and after formation of this, the World War II was finished. So they established a fair, by Bretton Woods Treaty, they established a fair monetary system for the world. And in this monetary system, the US dollar was associated with the gold. Okay, so US dollar was backed or was pegged or was constantly fixed its value with the precious metal gold. This system is called gold standard. In the past, British pound or other currencies had it, gold standard. But it became indirect gold standard because every other currency, like a franc of France, which no longer exists, or mark of the Germany, or rial of Iran, or Oman, or Saudi, and other currencies, you name it, the pound and yen, these are the important ones, okay? All were fixed, like today's Omani rial. Omani rial is fixed to US dollar. All the countries, but nowadays none of them, only a few currencies are pegged to the US dollar. Most of them are not. Like these ones now is forming the euro, and the euro is flexible. It's not constant, or Australian dollar if you wish, or Canadian dollar. Actually, Canadian dollar or Australian dollar did not exist at that time. They came far later time. So the problem ever since 1944, up until 1971, most countries with the Keynesian, we call it school of thoughts, perhaps this is a good way, or school of thoughts, or doctrine. Most countries, due to having a stable financial system, were booming. So their aggregate output were growing, and there were no serious inflation, there was no serious unemployment. Every country was performing, most countries were performing excellent. So what happened in 1971? The story is the following, that the bankers were not happy. The bankers were unhappy of this system because they were unable to print money, basically. So what they should do, they should basically go and see the government to maybe get rid of this Bretton Woods Treaty. And they used, there is something called, let me write it with a different color because then you can remember these names and can go and read about it. So the way that I am explaining is a little bit more international than the way that the book is explaining. So please read the book. It's also very, very useful. There is something called the Bilderberg Group. These are a group of people which mostly are Jews, and with a special school of Zionist way of thinking of Jews, which are the bankers, most of them. And they were unhappy, and they were thinking that they have no power to the world economy. And they approached one of their closest allies, Henry Kissinger, who attended this in 1971. There was it's a very secretive group, actually. They meet and they talk about how the world can move on. Henry Kissinger is still alive, and he was advisor to many governments in the United States, especially the Republican parties, also the Democratic parties. And he's now an old man, but still alive. And he was actually working during the Richard Nixon. So Bilderberg Group, by encouraging Kissinger to convince the Richard Nixon, which was a person similar to Donald Trump, very controversial figure, and he was impeached. He was not impeached, he had to resign, but he did very controversial things. And one of the most controversial was that come to the TV and say US dollar no longer has any parity with gold. And that was announced, and then the world changed. So all those most countries who were doing excellent, Germany, Japan, you name it, Middle Eastern countries, oil economies, Iran, they were doing excellent. Suddenly, the game changed. So the money became worthless. The US dollar suddenly became worthless. And then floating currency came. Floating currency. Or now we call it fiat or fiat currency. And in chapter related to the money, we're going to talk about the fiat currency later. So the starting from 1970s, the Keynesian model failed to answer the things, failed to work, we can say. And what was the Keynesian thing was saying that it's like going to go to the doctor. So we are basically fine-tuning the economy. If the economy is not tuned like an instrument or like a frequency of radio, you may not remember because now you you're using digital radios, most of you, but the radios have a tuning button here and a small button next to it. So if this is the radio and there was a gauge, so you're turning the tuning button, okay, and then you get the right frequency and the voice coming. And the next one, the small, was called actually fine-tuned. So if you're getting close to sounding like that, and then you're using the smaller fine-tuned button to get it the right spot of the frequency which the radio, the voice is clear. Okay, so they were using actually this expression of the fine-tuning for the economy. It's an expression of the use of government intervention whenever is necessary to make the economy growing smoothly and having low inflation, having low unemployment rate. Okay, so this fine-tuning actually was coined by this economist Walter Heller, who was the economist and advisor to the late John F. Kennedy, the very famous US president. And this was before the 70s. So all the way from 50s and 60s, the expression of fine-tuning were used for applying the Keynesian approach towards the economy. Whenever necessary, the government is taking action. And this fine-tuning stopped. It was not working. Actually, fine-tune became a part of the problems. Okay, so ever since 1970s, it happens. And what happened in 1970s after 1971, which the fiat currency came to existence? The first big turmoil, 1973. This is now known as the first oil shock. Okay, the first oil shock was Arab-Israeli war. For the sake of the Arab nations basically wanted to support the Palestinians, and there was a bad defeat. And but what happened? The Saudi Arabia and other Arab oil producers said that we are not going to sell oil to whoever supported Israel, and then the oil price actually jumped. And in the 1970s, 71, when the floating currency came, the US dollar in de facto was pegged to the crude oil rather than to the gold. So always you need to pick up a commodity to peg the money into it, and they choose to peg it to the crude oil because this was, and there is a big story that how the crude oil became the energy of the world in the 20th century. There are many documentaries on that. You should learn about it. I'm an energy economist, and I am fascinated by this story of oil and power and the hegemony of particular type of energy in the world system. The US was, and ever since it's called petrodollars actually. It's still a petrodollars. Okay, so once its relation was cut with the gold, they choose a commodity hoping that Shah of Iran and the Saudis will help them to stabilize the value of the oil. And Henry Kissinger did an excellent job and also pleasing them in one way or another. But the 1970s was the first debacle of where many countries, including the United States, faced huge turmoils. And it didn't end there. Towards the end, 1979, the second oil shock came. second oil shock. And in this one was related to the Iran revolution. And the taps of the oil was closed, and hence the price of oil again jumped up. And the system of the petrodollars faced a problem, and every country was, and in this situation actually the Keynesian approach of fine-tuning did not work. Actually, when they try to use it, the economists, they see that it's not working. So the explanation which John Maynard Keynes was giving us was that whenever we have a recession, usually when the output, aggregate output is dropping, we are having a high unemployment. So maybe normally we have 6% unemployment rate, suddenly it becomes 12% or becomes 20%. So this unemployment rate is because the macroeconomy is down. But usually in this situation, according to Keynes, was saying that we're going to have very low inflation. So if this is down and this is high, this is going to be down. So there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. They go opposite of one another. But what happened if they try to basically use the fine-tuning, and that happens in early 1980s, the early 1980s, 81, 82, 83. So the recession or high unemployment is known as, they use this word, the economy is stagnated, or stagnation happens. And once we have high inflation, so low inflation is okay, but when we have high inflation, so I write it above, high inflation, another problem. So the problem of inflation becomes serious. But already they were saying that once we have stagnation, we are having low inflation. So inflation is not an issue. Maybe deflation is a problem. Okay, stagnation is associated with deflation. We won't have the severeness, high prices. No, but in the 1980s, surprise, surprise, the high unemployment rate and high inflation happen at the same time. This is like mixing two words. So for the high unemployment, we called it stagnation. Plus, for high inflation, we use inflation. So they invented a new word by basically taking this R and mixing it together. So it's called stagflation. It means that the coexistence, and Keynesian economists were puzzled with this phenomena. They didn't know what to do with it. And in this course, in macroeconomics, we are saying that what happened in the... So let me explain. This is the whole story which you should know before you go into the details of the principles of macroeconomics. So the story started from the Great Depression, a period of which most countries, including the United States, faced big turmoils, economic issues, and the doctrines of classical economists constantly failed. If it was short run, why it took 10 years nearly? Once you put the S here, it's a decade. And it's a decade-long problem. How people would dare to say this is a short run problem. So it was not a short-run problem. It was because of a sequence of the interrelated macro issues which was tried to be ignored by the governments by sitting and doing nothing. So ever since the fine-tuning came, the phrase, as I said, is coined by Walter Heller to refer to the government's role in regulating inflation and unemployment in a constructive manner. So as the frequency of the economy, it means the performance of the economy, is doing well. And the stagflation, a situation which both high, this was happening in the early 80s, after the oil shocks, after the indirect gold standard was over, and we had the fiat currency. We could have a coexistence of two severe problems, both inflation and unemployment at the same time. So if you study macroeconomics, you would be able to understand the historical background of this. So economics in practice gives you a good read of what went wrong, and the pictures, just looking at the pictures of the queues where people were suffering from the depression or between the two First World and Second World War in the US or in the Europe, you would enjoy, and you should critically think. And one of the critical thinker was John Maynard Keynes himself. When we put things together ever since 70s, see, this is showing the growth of aggregate output, and these columns are showing the period of which aggregate output, which is measured by the real GDP of the countries. In the next chapter, we're going to exactly explain what do we mean by real GDP, is going downward. It's a negative growth. So you see it's going downward. In the 2008 financial crisis, in early 2000s, in the early 90s, and the stagflation period is here. The stagflation period is ever since 1979, Islamic Revolution, up until the early 1983. The economy was not growing, or basically growing negatively. And the oil crisis, the first oil shock, also shocked the many economies. The welfare economies faced the downturn. So number one is that we are wondering how we can explain the fluctuations of the real GDP, or aggregate output, or aggregate income. And if you put these things next to the unemployment rate, no surprise that whenever we have that, these are the same columns as shown in the previous one. And the moment we are entering a recession, it's a downturn of the economy, the unemployment rate goes up. So unemployment rate in the beginning of the 1973 was about 4%, but it reached around 9%. In the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the unemployment rate was about 7%, but it went up to 11% in the 1983. So of course then it drops, but again, whenever there is a recession, so we can say that during the recession, it is natural to have high unemployment. Donald Trump had a very low unemployment rate into his economy, and he was very happy, except the last year when the pandemic came. Then the unemployment rate overshooted, and he actually lost the election. It was very likely that Donald Trump will remain in the power if it was not this pandemic, COVID pandemic, was happening. Another one, in the 2008 financial crisis, or global financial crisis, we see that there's high unemployment rate. With the inflation, we pick up the 1970s. You see that we are expecting that the inflation should go downward because it's a recession, and recession should bring the deflation, but it was happening together. So it was going upward. And this is the stagflation phenomena is being explained. So if you want to understand the fluctuations of the aggregate output, you cannot basically only rely on studying microeconomics. If you want to understand unemployment and inflation, you cannot only rely on studying microeconomics. So for these phenomena and the interrelationship between aggregate output, inflation and unemployment rate, you must study macroeconomics, and for this you have to have a good understanding on the historical background of the emergence of macroeconomic as a branch of economics and the Keynesian revolution. So if sometimes I'm kidding, but it is very true that if you do not know who was and what contribution John Maynard Keynes made for developing the macroeconomic theory, actually you cannot pass this course. As long as you understand his contribution, then if you also score well in your exams, then you are ready to go to intermediate level of macroeconomics. Okay, so this is what we wanted to tell you, and these are the key terminologies of chapter 5. But we still have not explained anything, so I should say that if we are going to explain these three phenomena, so what we do the next is that for aggregate output growth, I put the growth in the bracket because this is, you have to understand the aggregate output and then you measure the growth. For this we are doing the chapter 6, and for unemployment rate and inflation rate, we are covering it in chapter 7. Okay, so before we start, we're gonna say, what are these phenomena? What are these phenomena? And then from chapter 8 onward, we do the macro model. So we explain the Keynesian model, and then we explain also more modified or more advanced way of the macro model, which came over the past ever since 1930s and the contribution of John Maynard Keynes. Just like micro side, which is evolving, the macro side is also getting better and better for explaining these phenomena. Thank you very much, and I'll post the video on chapter 6 and 7 soon. Thank you.